Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Zabe, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories. Alright, children, today we're going to finish up our stories on the book of Esther, and today we're going to go back and we're going to look at the feasts of Queen Esther and how Esther saved the Jewish people. So, Haman, the naughty enemy of the Jewish people, was very mad that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And this is because Haman was very prideful and arrogant, and he thought himself as good as the king. And he expected that everyone should bow down to him, but Mordecai wouldn't because Haman wasn't the king, and you only bowed down to the king. So Haman went and cast lots until on the 14th day of the 12th month, the lots came in his favor, and so he decided that on that day the following year he would have all the Jews killed. And he had convinced the king to let him write a letter saying that all the Jews throughout the empire should be killed on the 14th day of the 12th month. And he'd sent the letters throughout the empire, and whenever the Jews read the letters, they were greatly troubled and grieved, and they mourned. And in the city of Susa, Mordecai the Jew had put on sackcloth and ash, and he was mourning in the streets. We're all gonna die! Oh, it's so terrible! And Esther found out what was happening with Mordecai. And she thought, he's embarrassing himself. He's going to be such a shame and so embarrassing. And so she called one of her servants and says, can you please take out some fine clothes to Mordecai and tell him to get dressed and to stop mucking around out there and being silly. And the servant went out, and Mordecai refused and said, no. Now go back to Esther and you tell her that Haman has put out a decree saying that all the Jews are going to be killed. And you tell her that she's not going to be spared of this either. Just because she's in the palace doesn't mean she's going to be kept safe. Let her know that maybe God has put her in the position of queen for such a time as this. And so the servant went back and he relayed this message to Esther. And so she said, fine, I will go and talk to the king and I will see what I can do to save the Jewish people. But please pray for me. Esther asked all the Jewish people to pray and to fast on her behalf before she went to see the king. And the reason she did this is because no one was meant to go to the king of Persia unless they had been summoned. So unless the king said, oh, I want to see Esther, bring her to me, she was not allowed to go before the king. And so she was worried that if she just marched into the palace and said, hey, king, can I talk to you? That he would be angry with her like he was with Queen Vashti, and then he might get rid of her or even kill her. And so the Mordecai and the Jews agreed that they would pray and fast for Esther, and after 3 days, Esther went in to go see the king. Now remember, children, that one of the main themes of the book of Esther is about being polite and respectful, respecting the government, respecting your elders, and in particular with the case of the queens Vashti and Esther, that wives should respect their husbands. And so when Esther comes in to see the king, she comes in first, and the king is delighted to see her and calls her to come closer, because the king actually loved Esther and he was happy to see her. And she came in, and rather than being a bossy wife and saying, king, let the Jewish people live, she came in and she said, husband, if it seems good in your eyes, and if you think it's a good idea, can you and Haman come and join with me in having a massive big feast? And the king said, of course, that sounds a wonderful idea. And so that night, Esther, King Ahasuerus, and Haman all gathered and had a massive big feast. And the king turned to Esther and said, now, I don't think the feast is the only thing you wanted. So what else do you want, Queen Esther? You can have anything. I'll give you up to even half my kingdom. You can be in charge of half my kingdom if you want. And Esther says, no. I just, if it seems wise and if it seems like a good idea, would you and Haman like to have another feast with me tomorrow night? And the king said, well, yeah, that sounds a great idea. We'll see you tomorrow night. And that's when Haman went off and he saw Mordecai again, and Mordecai refused to bow to him, and he went home and he grizzled and he grumped and he decided that he should build a big gallows to get Mordecai hung on. And he'd gone to the king to get the king's permission, but instead the king asked Haman who they should honor, and Haman thought that the king meant him because Haman was very arrogant and thought he could do whatever he wanted and thought that who else would be honored by the king except for Haman. And he suggested that the king should honor this man by parading him around the street. And turns out that the king wanted to honor Mordecai because Mordecai had saved the king's life. And this made Haman even angrier. So, the next night, Haman, Ahasuerus, and Esther met for their big feast. And they were enjoying their feast. And the king turned to Esther and said, Esther, please, I know there's something else that you want to ask me, so can you please just tell me the truth? What is it that you want? And Esther said, well, Your Majesty, I have a problem. My people are the Jewish people, and someone has decided that the Jewish people should be killed. Now, if this was just slavery or we were just going to be locked up in prison, that's one thing, and I keep my mouth shut. But if I keep my mouth shut now, the Jews are going to be exterminated, and there won't be any Jews left in all of Persia. It is horrible. Someone wants to kill all of them. And the king was like, what? That's outrageous. Somebody's going to kill all the Jews. Mordecai is a Jew and he saved my life. And I just found out now that you're a Jew and you're my wife. Man, what horrible person out there would want to kill all the Jews? And Esther says, well, actually, my king, it's Haman over there. Haman wants to kill all the Jews. And the king's like, Haman, is this true? And he's like, well, yeah. And the king was like, ah, Haman! And he was so mad that he stomped off out into the garden. And Haman was like, oh no, I'm in trouble now. And he jumped on Esther and he begged her. He said, please, please, please forgive me. Please don't let the king hurt me. Please. But the king came back and he saw Haman jumping at Esther and he thought, what? What a disgusting man. He's even trying to kill the queen now in front of me. And he said, guards, guards, come quickly and save the queen. And the guards came running in and they grabbed Haman. And you naughty fella. And the king said, you horrible person. What should we do to the man this horrible? And one of the king's other officials came in and he said, well, king, I found out that Haman actually has gone and built these gallows next to his house, which he intended to use to kill Mordecai. And the king said, what? He wanted to kill Mordecai, the man who saved my life? That's it. Take Haman to the gallows and have him killed on them instead. And so they took Haman off and had him killed. And now the king, he called in Mordecai. Got to meet his essentially uncle-in-law, although since Mordecai had been raising Queen Esther, Mordecai was almost like the king's father-in-law. And he met Mordecai and he was so happy to meet him, and he made Mordecai the new prime minister of the Persian Empire. Mordecai now had Haman's job and was second to the king. And the king said, all right, well, what do you guys want to do now? And Mordecai and Esther said, well, king, can we just, undo Haman's decree that said all the Jews are going to get killed? And the king said, well, I would like to. I mean, Esther, you're my wife. Mordecai, you saved my life. And both of you are Jews, and I don't want to see you guys killed. And I'd love to change the decree, but I can't. The law of the Medes and the Persians is that once a king has made a decree, you can't undo the decree. So I'm sorry, but Haman's decree that says that anybody can kill a Jew on the 14th of the 12th still stands. But if you know some way to fix this, I'll let you fix it. And Mordecai, he was very clever. He knew then that because of the law of the Medes and the Persians, he couldn't undo Haman's decree. But Mordecai decided that the only way to fix this was to make another decree. And he said, well, if Haman's decree says that anybody's allowed to kill a Jew, why don't we make a decree that says if a Jew is attacked, they're allowed to kill the attacker back instead? And so the king said, excellent idea. Go ahead, Mordecai, you write that decree and send it throughout the empire. And so that is exactly what happened. Mordecai sent out a decree throughout all the land. And on the 14th day of the 12th month, Haman's decree was enacted, and many people throughout the empire decided to pick up swords and attack the Jews. But wherever the Jews were attacked, Mordecai's decree allowed them to fight back and kill their attackers. And this happened throughout the empire. And heaps of people were killed because they tried to kill the Jews. And God kept them safe. And now that people learnt that the queen and the prime minister were Jews, and they saw how the Jews were able to be protected by God, many other Persians also converted to Judaism, and they became believers in the God of Israel. And at the end of the book of Esther, it says that this book was written to explain the feast of Purim. So Purim is the Hebrew word for lots, which is what Haman cast to decide that the 14th day of the 12th month should be the day that he should have his decree to kill the Jews. But the Jews decided that God had actually reversed Haman's decree. And this is interesting as well, because Haman was casting lots. He was using demonic pagan practices to try and determine which day would be used to kill the Jews, and instead God reversed it and used that lot casting to predict the day that the Jews would be saved. And this goes to show that God is always in charge, not just over the things of this world, not just over earthly things, but even over spiritual things. That God has control even over the demons and the pagans, and that God can manipulate their false worship, that God can manipulate their worship of the demons and use it for the good of his own people. For God took Haman's demonic lot casting and used it to predict the day that God would liberate the Jewish people from their enemies. And so that, children, is the story of how Esther saved the Jews, and that also brings us to the end of our 3-part series on the book of Esther. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've enjoyed these 3 videos on the book of Esther. I know they're a little bit longer than normal, but that's because I've tried to condense the entire book of Esther into just 3 videos. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.